Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability is the title of my latest book. And obviously it's about permaculture, but it's talking about that in terms of the underlying principles and the implications for a future where the global energy supply, following the peaking of oil supply, is going into a permanent decline. And I call that beyond sustainability to sort of really challenge a lot of the current orthodoxy in sustainability thinking. In a way, it's also suggesting being beyond the sustainability as a some sort of steady state, where we just get onto this place where everything is sustainable and then everything ticks over. And that's, of course, an attractive idea in many ways, but if we stand back and look at the huge changes through the development of Western civilization and going back to the roots of agriculture 10,000 years ago, we can see this stepping stones with many hiccups and collapses, but basically stepping up from the use of renewable resources through agriculture and forestry. Europe reached some sort of peak of exploitation of its resources roughly about 1500, and just had enough resources to reach out and colonise other underexploited places in the world. And then with that power came back, and within Europe itself tapped this enormous source of power in coal. And of course that was this stepping stone in the 19th century into the really immense source of high quality energy in oil, and then that has been a stepping stone to the final high quality fossil fuel source of gas, which we're going through this great transition at the moment. And of course a large part of that story is actually came out of the United States, which was the second richest oil province in the world after Saudi Arabia. And unfortunately, American ingenuity and economic power doesn't actually come out of American brilliance. It actually comes out of the oil well. And that the sort of society that developed that could actually use all these resources is a result of energy. And this lesson constantly through history that societies are primarily a result of what nature provides, rather than somehow human brilliance actually creates these resources. So I think that understanding, and I think the climb up this great energy mountain in the last 100 years, and even perhaps looking at that in terms of the life of someone born in 1950 and dying in 2025, that in that 75 years over half the world's oil will have been consumed in one generation, is sort of, it's hard for us to actually grasp how big a source of power this is compared with natural energies that used to sustain society. And it's interesting how late that power really became the dominant driving force. And one argument is that the 1930s depression was really about the structural hiccup as the economy shifted from being based on the power from agriculture, and to a secondary extent the power from coal, to one actually driven by the power of oil. And people often talk about, well, the hazards of global depression, and that maybe that will be like the 1930s. Well, the particular social circumstances, it's very hard to say what the future holds, but the important difference is that war and increased economic activity will not bring about some economic revival the way it did after the Great Depression of the 1930s, because that was an economic stalling in a context of massively increasing energy availability, we now have the changes happening in a context of declining energy. Of course, in looking at the possible futures, we can't deny the possibility that some source of energy emerges, even though it's very, very late in the piece for that to happen. Over the last 50 years, there's been so many examples given of free energy, from the bizarre to things that governments totally believed in, like that nuclear power was going to be so cheap that it would be free. None of those things have come about, and but the possibility of sort of science fiction type expansion, moving to the planets to exploit minerals, artificial intelligence through computers, genetic engineering, all of these things somehow creating some sort of human systems that can sort of push back all the environmental debt and somehow sort of power on in this direction that things are going. All of that depends on a massively increased energy base from somewhere. So I think that's highly unlikely. Certainly all of the things that I've been involved in with permaculture over the last 20 years or more, they would end up in the dustbin of history in this sort of scenario. So this techno-fantasy scenario, I don't see this as to do with human choice. I see it as an outcome of energy flow. But then the sort of future that most people feel is more likely is this, what I call this green tech stability, that we are somehow going to steady out on some sustainable plateau using energy efficiency, the factor 4, factor 10 revolution, renewable energies. And I think although elements of the strategies that are adapted to that type of future are incredibly appropriate, like wind power, energy efficiency, all of these types of things, I think it's much more likely that we're facing a continuous reduction in available energy to each succeeding generation. And that although that's a sort of a depressing scenario for most people, it's depressing because we have this growth culture, which we've developed over 500 years. But if you actually go back to the ancient Greeks, for example, they believed the world was originally created perfect and it declined with each succeeding generation, and an ethical life was lived by passing it on in as best shape as possible. They didn't find that depressing. It was just reality. So I think this whole idea of continuous material expansion is something we need to discard. But I think what we can take from our past culture is the culture of continuous change, because I don't think we are going into some steady state sustainability anywhere in the near future. We're actually going on a continuous roller coaster or slide or gentle descent, some pathway down where each generation has to invent new ways to do things and pass on the lessons to the next generation, but they have to then do something else. And the driving force behind that is less and less energy each generation. But the great thing about that is that our culture of change, we're actually adapted to that. We know in a way what this story is of continuous change. We're used to it because we've had generations of it. And there's a tendency to think that it's, yes, in the last few decades we've had incredibly rapid change, but if we listen to the stories of older people who were born before there were aeroplanes and look at what the change was in their lifetime, it's perhaps even greater. So I think that's an empowering sense of change in the future. And so permaculture is really the full-on creative designed response to this pathway of less energy. And what that really means is that instead of the green tech solutions being the absolute at the forefront, those that actually reconnect us with nature, with agriculture, forestry, gardening, all of the ways we sustainably get resources from nature, which is a sort of a modest resource base compared with the fossil resource base, and has so many design implications. It involves more people working at food production. It involves moving around less. It involves a decentralised society. It involves lots and lots of small local decisions and small solutions rather than big centralised solutions. Many of these patterns that we can see in solutions associated with permaculture reflect basically a set of design principles for systems with decreasing energy availability. And so I think it's exciting that after 30 years of dealing with a situation where societies as a whole hasn't been so interested in these sort of solutions, that these solutions now will actually have an enormous power, because they will be, if you like, responding to the market realities of how come energy costs so much, how come food prices will start to go up, how come buying new things start to become more expensive. So all of the ideas of repairing things, of recycling things, so many sensible environmental strategies that have been hard to promote actually become just common sense. So I think it's an enormously exciting time in many ways.
So you don't subscribe to the last man standing, or the likelihood of total chaos, or you sound a bit more hopeful than Richard Heinberg talks about the last man standing scenario as being the default scenario for our cultures, industrialized cultures.
I think there's a lot of toxic thinking that we inherit from this, from our past culture, and that is obviously extremely dangerous. And my hope is that the learning process of people attempting to operate in that way and failing, like that the idea that you can spend resources to capture resources actually is ecologically adaptive in an era of rising energy, because the cost of actually that you exert in doing that, the damage, the destruction, is repaid by what you manage to harvest or steal or whatever you might call it. But moving beyond the moral judgments about whether that's right or wrong, in an era of rising energy through the 20th century, that worked. In the 21st century, those that pursue that type of strategy will actually be driven down faster. And I think that will apply at the individual level, at the community level, and obviously with nations. So of course, if we are part of nations that pursue that strategy, of course there are many sort of gloomy scenarios and possibilities, but my hope would be that the world is informationally networked enough that the failure of those strategies will become very obvious very quickly, and that the other strategies that people have often seen as being idealistic or utopian, that cooperative processes are actually just effective survival strategies in an era of declining energy. And we see this from studying nature. We can see in ecosystems that have large amounts of free energy, we see pioneer and aggressive species which can capture and occupy a whole site prevail. And when we see ecosystems which have steady or very limited energy, we see large amounts of symbiotic and cooperative relationships and network structures and a great diversity. So I suppose part of the permaculture strategies are relying on this ecological and systems thinking analysis, that we can see the patterns in nature and the patterns in human history that suggest that we will move into a cooperative future. But of course that process that we can see maybe in a large historical scale might be extraordinarily rocky and extraordinarily dangerous, and for individual people, groups of people, whole nations, that could involve catastrophes. But we can look at the 20th century and say this era of massive increase in economic resources has actually not been a happy one for perhaps significant numbers of people on the planet. I mean, the 20th century in some ways has, brought the greatest wars and extraordinary exploitation of people and nature, which is actually quite natural because there was so much to fight over. When there's less to fight over, nature and all its parts, including people, learn pretty quickly that it's not worth fighting. The examples of cooperation that most dramatically come to mind are of course in human society when there are natural disasters, that people actually just come together and cooperate and get over their sort of differences, and they sort of come to terms with, many important things. We can also see how sometimes there's a larger crisis and suffering, such as in Britain during the Second World War. There was enormous suffering, but actually nutritional status of people in industrial England went up because they were all food gardening and looking after each other in cooperative ways. So, and that many people who lived through that time actually don't necessarily remember it as just a terrible time. In nature, we can see that in ecosystems where there is very limited energy, and primarily in the form of fertility, for example, Australian ecosystems are remarkable in how integrated and cooperative rather than competitive many of the relationships are, because there's actually not enough resources to be all accumulated in dominant species, that there aren't also a lot of large carnivores. There's not enough resources to support them, so sometimes the length of food chains is actually not enormously long, because the length of a food chain, how many stages there are in it, actually relate to how much energy flow there is. Similarly, in human societies, we now have these economic chains from primary production through to final consumer that a huge number of middlemen in between processes, and the way we will deal with that in an energy descent future is actually cut out the middleman, radically cut out the middleman. When we start to grow food ourselves and prepare it for our family, we cut out an enormous chain and increase the efficiency of doing things by doing it at a smaller scale. Perhaps a middle example that's a very dramatic and socially powerful one is community supported agriculture, where people are buying food directly from farmers in a subscribing relationship. So there's a social and economic relationship that develops between a farmer and their customers, and that those types of relationships develop enormous degrees of economic and resource efficiency, and that these efficiencies actually, I believe, exceed the importance of the factor 4, factor 10 revolution that Amory Lovins and others have promoted in industry, we can see a factor 4, factor 10 revolution in behaviour and doing things in simple cooperative ways. And because those simple ways of growing food, of providing education for children at home, of community processes of exchange and barter, are dealing with actual essential needs, whereas a lot of the green industrial revolution is still actually dealing with making more efficient the production of things we don't really need. And ironically, rather than more sustainable ways of production, the real revolution in the future is what has been called by the UN sustainable consumption. But rather than it being some sort of buying green products, a lot of it is working out how we can live without actually bothering to consume those items at all. How we can learn to provide our livelihoods working from home without bothering to commute. How we can work out how to just avoid doing something. And I think the permaculture principle of use small and slow solutions often shows up with an analysis where, well, what's a better way we can do this? And then stepping back and say, well, do we really need to do this at all? And of course that's enormously threatening to corporations and to governments who are relying on expansion of consumption, expansion of markets, and a source of tax revenue. But just because we might see a massive shrinking in the formal economy doesn't mean to say human well-being automatically must collapse, because if we see a huge explosion in the household economy that actually doesn't work with money, it works with mutual agreement, and the regulator is in fact love in that economy, then it doesn't matter that there's this decline in the formal economy, because what has been called the invisible economies of the household and of community come in to replace that. And we already see that in many countries that have actually gone through severe economic decline. Not all those examples are very pretty, and the situation that many people in countries like Russia, for example, with the economic collapses there, everyone grows food in gardens. Of course, part of that is the need to do it because their wages don't actually provide enough to actually buy food. But it's wrong to sort of merely analyse these systems from above and say, oh, this is actually disastrous, There's lots of evidence that in the huge economic collapse that happened in Indonesia in 1997, that many people at the bottom of society, even though they lost their jobs, were actually better off. People who were living in slum tenements, who were being harassed by the police all the time to kick them off land because a new multi-storey office tower had to be built there. There was no more of that, and people started gardening because they had some sort of limited tenure, or they went back to their cousin's farm and helped out on the farm. And of course all of those processes cannot be seen in these large scale economic forces. I don't want to sort of trivialise how radical and harsh these transitions could be, but there's no point focusing just on this is going to be terrible, because that just encourages people to say, well, we'll just bury our heads in the sand and ignore this problem. So, in permaculture we talk about that the problem is the solution, and we find this in challenging ways constantly with weeds in our garden. What can we learn from this weed? How can we use this plant, this pest? How can we make use of some wasted resource that someone sees as rubbish to be discarded. So in a way, that's a training for how can we see this large problem as an opportunity.